All right, welcome everybody again. This is Mr. Zawacki, and today what we're going to be talking about is the plant kingdom, the four main types of plants, how they're different from each other, and their diversity on life. Now here, and this is really the basis of this entire PowerPoint, this slide right here. We're going to be talking about the four types of plants that are on Earth today. Every single plant on Earth is one of those four that you see. It can either be bryophytes, which are like your mosses, or ferns. Seedless vascular plants would be your ferns. The other one, the third one, are called your gymnosperms, which are similar to evergreens, like pine trees, and angiosperms, which are your flowering plants. So again, there are four main types. You have your mosses, your ferns, gymnosperms, which are like pine trees, and angiosperms are anything that has flower or fruit. Who wants to give a guess right now? Which one do you think there are more of on this earth than anything else? Bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, or angiosperms? Just a guess. You can't be wrong. Well, I mean, I guess you can be wrong, but it doesn't matter. All right, I'm seeing mixed results between the first one and the fourth one, which is a good guess. Also the ferns. The correct answer is the most adapted. Remember from natural selection how the most adapted versions are the ones that, pass down their traits? Well, it's the same thing with plants. There are more angiosperms or flowering plants than any other plant on Earth. And it also goes evolutionarily. Mosses are the very first things to colonize land. They were the first plants on Earth. Ferns came second after a couple different adaptations. Evergreens or gymnosperms came third, and then angiosperms came the latest. However, they're the most adapted, so they're the most numerous of the four as well. All right, we're going to be revisiting this cladogram throughout. You're going to see it with more added features throughout this live lesson. But this cladogram shows you the evolution or the classification of the four types of plants. Green algae is actually at the bottom. What is the name that green algae is in terms of angiosperms, gymnosperms, seedless vascular plants, and bryophytes? What is green algae compared to them? Remember from evolution, what do you trace your genetics back to? Good job, Catlin. You got it first. Yes, it would be a common ancestor. Green algae is where all plants originated from. Green algae grows in our oceans, but sometimes also fresh water. And it is the common ancestor that everything came from. So green algae is your common ancestor. Remember, the first thing to come out or to evolve from green algae were your bryophytes, which is mosses. And how did you get from green algae to bryophytes? Well, here are the derived traits. Remember we learned these on the classification lesson? Well, this derived trait is the evolution of specialized cells and tissues, and a cuticle as well. So after that got adapted, mosses came to be. So bryophytes, think moss. This is all your bryophytes. And they're found everywhere. When you go walking in the woods, you will see bryophytes for sure. They're very short. They don't grow very tall. They really just cover wet, damp areas, and they colonize there. Again, they're small. They're found only in damp, moist areas on land. The leaves must touch water for photosynthesis. So that's kind of old school right there. The leaves have to be touching water to do their photosynthesis. All plants do photosynthesis. But it looks like mosses have the hardest time because they have to be in direct contact with water. And their reproductive cell, sperm, swims through water to reach egg and gametophyte. So Bryophytes also need to reproduce in the water. So this is kind of like, it's the very first plant on Earth, but it's that for a reason. It's the least adapted, it has to reproduce in the water, and it has to do photosynthesis by touching water. So that's not the greatest thing for land, but it's also the first thing that was able to come on land then. Yep, very good. And here is a sporophyte. This is the beginning of a new moss plant, or the spore that comes from it. Okay, remember I said we're going to revisit the cladogram. Now, bryophytes were first, your mosses. Remember they have the specialized cells and tissue. They also have a cuticle, which we'll talk about soon. Then, seedless vascular plants came about. Seedless vascular plants, remember, those are your ferns. They adapted a vascular tissue. That's how they became more adapted than the mosses. So as we go through these, I want you to just keep thinking of how these plants get better and better. First, they were able to colonize out of land with a cuticle and specialized cells tissue. Then they became even more adapted to land by evolving a vascular tissue. What a vascular tissue is, vascular means like tubes or veins. Well, that's exactly what they are. They're a set of tubes that transports materials around the plant. They allow plants to grow taller, and there's two parts to vascular tissue. There's the xylem, which deals with water, and there's the phloem, which deals with food or nutrients. Right, Stephen. The further we go into the cladogram, this is the more traits and more adaptations these plants have. So mosses are the least adapted, but they're still here. Ferns are the second most adapted. Then you have your gymnosperms, like your pine trees, and then angiosperms are the most adapted and most numerous. However, and I'll explain it later, as you go up, they have all of the adaptations, so from before, which I'll show you and explain. But yes, with vascular tissue, that's a set of tubes that transports materials around the plant. It allows plants to grow taller, and there's two parts of the vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Xylem carries water, phloem carries nutrients or sugar. So it literally, they're small tubes that go from the bottom of the plant all the way to the top. They're inside the tree. It's like the veins and arteries of the tree. And remember, seedless, that means no seeds. Vascular, they do have the vascular tissue though, plants. And those are all ferns. Yep, you will see those in Florida. You'll see those in other areas, usually areas that get quite a bit of rainfall because they still need a lot of water. But if you notice, these ferns grow much taller than mosses, and they're more adapted. And I've already mentioned this. This is just the same slide twice. Remember about the vascular tissue? It's just the tubes that allow the plant to grow taller, xylem, water, phloem, food. And ferns live further on land. They still have to be in moist areas, but they don't need actually water to be in order to live. Remember, mosses need to be in water to live. Ferns don't need that, but they still have to be in a moist type of area. Sporophytes survive fine with vascular tissue, but in order to reproduce, the sperm cells still must swim to the egg in the tiny gametophyte. So you still have to have a little bit of water, but not as much as the bryophytes. So they're beginning to not need as much water, is what I'm telling you. And then for a question, angiosperms keep the traits given down. Do gymnosperms burn? Yes, exactly. Mosses get the cuticle and they get the specialized cells and tissues. ferns still have that, but in addition, they have the vascular tissue. So they keep adding, but they retain everything from before. And here's what a fern gametophyte looks like, just the very beginning of what a fern, like a baby fern, would look like. You don't need to know these specific vocabulary words. They're not on anything for your bio course. Okay, so revisiting the cladogram. Remember, bryophytes came first. They were your mosses. Seedless vascular plants, or your ferns, came second because they have a vascular tissue. Now the third one, or the second most adapted species on Earth, is the Gymnosperms. You want to think pines, pine trees. That's a great example. They were able to evolve pollen and seeds. No ferns or mosses have those, so this led to a new type of plant. After pollen grains and seeds became adapted, then you were able to have gymnosperms. Here's a picture of a pollen grain right here. This is the killer for some of our allergies, especially within the next month. Get ready for it. But pollen is a main allergen source for sure, including myself. That's microscopically what it looks like. It is harmless to us, but our immune systems don't believe you, even though if you try to tell it that it is harmless. So some of our immune systems overreact, which causes an allergic reaction. What a pollen grain looks like, though, it's a hard covering around sperm. Sperm cells are actually inside of here, but it's a hard covering around it to protect it. It's very lightweight. That's why you see it in the wind all the time, and it travels by wind as well. And it removes water requirement for fertilization. It has all the water it needs inside, so it doesn't even need water for fertilization. Remember how ferns and mosses, you got to have at least some water? Well, now pine trees, they don't need water at all. Pollen can travel without water. It has all the water requirement inside of it. So also, kind of an eye-opening thing, pollen is just the male reproductive cell of pine trees and things like that, and other flowering plants. So all that pollen going around is literally the male reproductive cell from different plants trying to pollinate other plants. So if you didn't know that, now you do. Okay, so when the pollen comes in contact, this is like, okay, so let me try to draw this better to show you. This is like your flower. Here's all the petals of the flower or the other parts of the flower. And if you ever notice, you ever look at like really cool flowers, you'll see that there's a center called the pistil inside of the flower. The pistil is the female structure of the flower. These little pollen grains up here, that's the male structure of the flower. So the pollen grains actually get stuck, and they get stuck by wind, or they get stuck by rain, or they get stuck by a bumblebee or an insect carrying it. It doesn't matter, but these pollen grains get stuck on top of the pistil of the flower. And what happens is the pollen grain will then kind of open up, and the sperm cells will swim through the stigma and style until it reaches the ovary, which is the female reproductive cell. So let me explain that again. This whole structure is the flower, okay? In the center of the flower is the female structure called the pistil. When pollen gets attached to it, remember, pollen is the male reproductive cell. Pistil is female. So when the pollen gets stuck there, the sperm cells will be released, and they'll swim inside the pistil, and then they will go into the ovary and fertilize it. you guys know what happens, what is created when pollen fertilizes the ovary? So what does pollen plus ovary create? Do you guys know? Want to guess? When the pollen cells or the sperm cells plus the ovary, if they fertilize, what does that create? You got it. Good job, Stephen. Yep. Cameron, Lauren, Jalen, Noah. It creates a seed or a fruit containing seeds. So anytime you see a seed, that's a baby plant. We know that already. But how is it created? Well, pollen plus ovary. The sperm inside the pollen plus the ovary creates a seed or a fruit containing seeds. That's exactly what is created and how a flower reproduces. It's also possible for that to happen asexually or sexually. If the pollen comes from the same plant, that's asexual reproduction. It'll create another copy of itself. But if the pollen comes from a different plant, that's sexual reproduction because that's two different individuals. Okay? So after these adaptations, after you get a vascular tissue and you can reproduce through the air, well, now plants can be full colonizations of land. They can take over the land, which they did, as we see outside right now. Seeds, remember that's the product of pollen plus ovary. What a seed is, it's like a baby plant. They have a tough coat and it protects the newly fertilized embryo. So the tough coat on the outside is just for protection. And the embryo is on the inside. It also contains a supply for food, which is called endosperm, to survive during a dormancy period. So seeds can live like a long time without water because the inside of the seed has it covered. It has the water that it needs, it has the food that it needs, it has the protection that it needs. So a seed is a very good thing because it's very protective of that baby plant. Think of it like a baby wearing all kind of, protective shields and armor. That's exactly what a seed is like for a plant. Okay, remember this is still your third type, Gymnosperms or pine trees. You want to think cones, and which is found on pine trees. I teach my 5-year-old kid this, but anytime you go out and look at cones, you'll see two types. The bigger cones are the female ovaries. The very small ones are the pollen or male cones, and they look much smaller. They almost like little, large-sized worms with pollen that comes off of them. And anytime you walk under a pine tree, you'll see both. You'll see the girl or the female ovaries, and then you'll see the male cones as well. And the male cones release pollen into the air, and then sometimes it will fertilize the same tree, which is asexual reproduction. Else, it can go to other plants and fertilize another plant, and that's called sexual reproduction. It just depends where the pollen goes. Okay, and then the question, if a pine tree can grow both of them, why not just grow seeds by itself instead of creating a sexual reproductive system? Good question. It still needs to reproduce, but trees have the advantage that they prefer, if a tree can think, which it kind of can, it prefers to reproduce through sexual reproduction. It does not choose to reproduce with itself. It chooses to reproduce through sexual reproduction. But if it needs to survive to reproduce, then it will work for asexual reproduction. That's why you see them both in separate areas. On angiosperms, they're both in the same area. But again, as I was saying, it would prefer to reproduce through sexual reproduction because that creates more variation and diversity, which is exactly what it wants to have. And trees do think. You think trees are just barely a living thing, but They do think. I've read articles before where if a tree is dying, other trees will help that tree out, attach their roots, and give them the nutrients that it needs to stay alive. So, I mean, that's thought right there. So, definitely they're smarter organisms than you think, but they're very basic in terms of organisms too. And then what happens when the squirrels eat the pine nuts? Well, it creates many, 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 many seeds. Remember how with natural selection you have overproduction? Trees do the same thing. They're going to overproduce so much. So many of those things will get eaten, just hopefully not all of them. Yep, and I believe that, Catlin. I read articles similar to that before. All right. So there's the gymnosperm pollen strategy. We kind of already, I just got done talking about that, but they release a lot of pollen, and hopefully just at least some will pollinate. That's called overproduction. Remember, all living things in the wild overproduce. They do that on purpose so they can continue their species. All right, and this is the completed cladogram. Remember, green algae is your common ancestor. It's where all plants came from. That was in the water, though. And then the first plant to colonize land were your mosses, or bryophytes. And they were able to colonize land because of the cells, tissues, and the cuticle. Second was seedless vascular plants, or your ferns. And they were able to evolve a vascular tissue to allow them to grow tall. Things that have vascular tissues can grow tall. Then the gymnosperms came out, which evolved pollen and seeds that we learned about. And then the last one, anything with a flower or fruit, are angiosperms. And they evolved flowers and fruits that no other plant has. That's why they're the most adapted. I said we were going to talk about the cuticle. I thought I had a slide about that, but I guess I don't. Does anybody know what a cuticle is? All plants have a cuticle. Angiosperms, gymnosperms, ferns, mosses, they all have a cuticle. But do we know what a cuticle is? It is part of our nail, but plants have it too. Do you know what the reason why? It is a protective layer. If you ever feel a plant and it feels waxy or almost like plasticky on the leaves, that's what a cuticle is. And it's a protective layer that holds in water. So like on those dry days where it doesn't rain for 5 or 6 days, plants are still green outside. Why? Because they have a cuticle that it's like a coating on the leaf that holds in the water. All plants have that. So just make sure you know what a cuticle is too. All right, remember I said angiosperms, they're your flowering plants, so definitely think flowers or fruit. They're the most diverse plant group. There's more angiosperms than any other plants on Earth because they're the most adapted. So you're going to have more of them than anything else. Nope, Alana, they already have the cuticle, so that's why even if you don't water them for a few days, they may wilt, but they probably won't die because they still have the cuticle. Now, if you continue to not water them, they would die. Okay, so for flowers, the reason why they have flowers, it's the most adapted structure of plants, really. They attract animals to help carry pollen to the next flower. So they grow flowers to purposely attract animals to them. And they want to attract animals to help them pollinate, like bees or insects. Their color and scent attract animals to obtain sugar from the plant. Exactly what they want to do on purpose. And those animals or wind or whatever will carry the pollen from other plants. And it'll travel from the male stamen part of the flower to the pistil or the female part of the flower, to locate the ovary and reproduce. I just explained that. Remember, with the pollen releasing the sperm cells, and then the pollen plus ovary will create the seed or the fruit-containing seeds. That's exactly what flowers do too, just like cones. And some angiosperms will still wind pollinate too. Grass is a good example of pollination through wind. That's how grass reproduces, and small things like that. They'll use the wind to carry their pollen. Okay, so here's a couple pretty pictures of some different types of flowers. Again, they're used to attract other animals to help pollinate them. And then after the fertilization, the ovary becomes the fruit, or seeds inside of fruit. These are all the products. Looks very good, but these are all the products of fertilization. This is the beginning of new plants, the fruit or the seeds containing the fruit. That's the beginning of the next plant. And fruit, we know it's very good for us. Fruit typically collects sugar to attract animals. That's why there's fruit there as well. And the plants want animals to eat the fruit. They want them to eat the seeds, because seeds, a lot of the time, remember they have that protective layer? Well, they can survive an animal digestive system. They can go in the mouth and out the other end and still be completely fine. So when that animal does its business, it will release the seeds out of its digestive system, and all the other stuff that goes with it will be fertilizer to help that seed grow. The plant knows this. It wants the animals to eat the plants so they can drop the seeds elsewhere and grow more plants. And some of the fruit are not even eaten by animals. They just help wind carry the seeds, like dandelions. But most of the time, fruits are, the purpose of a fruit is so an animal can eat it and then literally, get rid of the entire seed later and grow more plants because of it. Remember, like I said, they can produce asexually if it's the same flower, pollen and ovary from the same flower. Many plant parts can regrow to make a whole new organism when separated. Strawberries do that. Or they can do sexual reproduction from a different plant. So again, guys, kind of in conclusion with everything, here are your 4 types of plants. You've got to know those 4. This is what you talk about for 605. Your common ancestor is your green algae. That's a water plant that led to all the other plants. Then over time, specialized cells and tissues and a cuticle came. Out comes plant number 1, your mosses. Then vascular tissue, those xylem and phloem tubes formed. Then you got your ferns. Then you got pollen grains and seeds. Then came your gymnosperms, or your pine trees with cones. And then flowers and fruits evolved. And now you have your current new plant, which are your angiosperms. Will there ever be a new type of plant that evolves from those? Probably. In our lifetime? No. But maybe in the next 1 million years, yeah, there might be a whole new plant that exists that is even better and smarter than all the other 4. We'll see. But it just kind of goes along with evolution. These plants are still adapting and changing. They're smarter than you think. And the 4 types of plants still exist on Earth today. So even the least adapted still has a place on Earth, for sure. All right. Well, that's it, guys. Thank you guys again for coming. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box on the bottom. But if not, you are free to go. We'll talk next week about another lesson. So please do your best to come. And thank you guys for coming, and we'll talk to you next time.